The French Chef is made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Here on this elegant banquet table is a fowl lineup. A roast chicken, a roast turkey, and a roast duck. They're waiting patiently for their vegetables. They'll just have to wait a little bit longer while we do vegetables for the birds today on the French Chef. Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. When you're doing roast turkey or roast goose or roast duck, it's nice to have something a little bit unusual in the way of vegetables. I don't mean unusual vegetables, but I mean unusual ways of doing the usual vegetables. Take mashed potatoes, for instance. Some people would just rather leave them, but they can be terribly nicely done, especially if you do them in the French manner. And I think one thing you have to be sure of when you're doing mashed potatoes is that you have the right kind of potato. This is the baking potato, which I find is much the best for mashing because it mashes up smooth and fluffy. This is the all-purpose potato. You notice the difference in shape. The all-purpose is usually round and the baking one is long. That's one way of telling it. And the all-purpose I don't think is nearly as good for mashing as the baking potato. And I like to, after they've gotten peeled, I like to cut them so that they'll cook more quickly. So I've cut that into pieces that are quarters, and then if you cut them before you're going to cook them, you should put them in water. And then you can either boil them in salted water or you can steam them. And I thought you'd rather like to see this Norwegian steamer I bought when I was over there. It's just an aluminum cylinder with holes in the bottom, and it has a tight-fitting cover, and it fits over boiling water. And then when the water boils, you see this is not in touching the water at all. Then the steam comes up and thoroughly envelops the potatoes so that they cook really quite fast and they don't get quite as mushy as sometimes they do with other types of potatoes. Now when you're going to cook mashed potatoes, 1 pound mashes up into about 2 cups. And we're going to do mashed potatoes for 6 people. And so we have 2.5 pounds, which will mash up into about 5 cups. And now these potatoes are all steamed, so I'm going to show you how you mash them. So I'm going to take my great contraption over here. You don't have to use a Norwegian masher, I mean a Norwegian steamer. I don't know where you'd be able to get one anyway, but you can use a colander. You can just use anything that will sit above a pan and that you can cover so that the steam will come up into it. And I'm going to empty out the water here, and then we'll mash them. And every country seems to have its own method for mashing. And this is the French method. This is a rather old-fashioned method called this is a tammy. And what it is a wooden drum and a screen which is set into it, and then you would put this over your pan, and then you have what's known as a champignon, or it's just a masher. A champignon means a mushroom. I don't know why that looks like a mushroom, but they say it does. And then you put your potatoes in top of the screen, and then you pound them all down in. And the French theory is that you want to be sure that you pound and you don't go around this way, because if you do that then that activates the, I don't know what you would call it, sort of the gluey quality of the potato, and that makes them sticky. And then you see you've mashed them all through, and then you have your potatoes on the bottom. And so they all come out very nicely and smoothly. And then when we were in Germany, I got a great big German potato ricer, which I think is rather fun. Actually, I think either using the drum sieve or a ricer makes the best potatoes. I don't like them all turned around in an electric machine, those whipped potatoes. I don't think they're as nice. See, that just goes in, and there come the potatoes out. I rather this sort of looks nice and solid and German. And then this is an American potato ricer, which I got in a department store, and it cost, a little over $1. And the potatoes just go in, and then you go, woof. But what's lovely about ricing them is they come out so nice and fluffy. Now I'll put in another bit. And then, after you've mashed your potatoes, you have another step, which is the drying out of them. And for that, you set your pan over heat. And this, no matter how you mash your potatoes, you should do this. You set it in a heavy pot over heat, and then you stir them around until you see that the bottom, now to see that I've got this really on hot, until the bottom of the potatoes till the bottom of the pan is beginning to film with the potatoes. You can see there's that little film of potato, and that is what it's doing, is getting rid of your final excess water. And so, then if you're going to make plain mashed potatoes, you would beat in some butter and some milk and some salt and pepper. And I have some that I've done ahead of time, and you can mash them ahead of time and keep them uncovered over simmering water. And I'm going to put a little bit of butter into these because we're going to do a different recipe. And I'm going to first put a little bit of butter in because they can then sit over water as long as they have just a little bit of flavoring in. Then, actually, it's better not to do potatoes any more ahead than you have to. But one thing is, never, when they're hot, never cover them or they get that sort of funny old potato taste. You could keep them for 10 or 15 minutes over water, hot water like this, uncovered, and stir them up every now and then. But what we're going to do is pomme de terre à l'ail. And this is the lye to garlic heads. Now this is going to seem absolutely insane, but it's a perfectly lovely dish, which is mashed potatoes with a garlic sauce in them. And so, for 6 people, we're going to use 2 whole heads of garlic. You think that's probably cuckoo to do, but if you use any less, you'll regret it, I'll tell you. Now, here's your whole head of garlic, and you just have to break it apart, and then then they're going to be peeled. This is lovely, fresh garlic that I got at our Italian market, and they're nice big cloves. I think I've counted them, and I think there are about 14 garlic cloves in each head. So that means you'll have 28 to 30 cloves of garlic. And then to peel them easily, because they have to be peeled, you'll drop these heads into simmering water and simmer them for 2 minutes. And then after that, they're very easy to peel. And I have some here. Those have been simmered for 2 minutes, and then the skin just comes off very easily indeed. You see, there you are. And then we're going to cook the garlic for 20 minutes in butter in a covered pan. And these are going to cook in 4 tablespoons of butter. And then we're going to use the rest of that butter to make our sauce. And so in go our 28 heads of peeled garlic. I've got one there that wasn't peeled. And then you mix them all over with the butter, and then cover the pan, and then you want to cook them very, very, very slowly on lowest heat for 20 minutes, and keep looking at them every once in a while because you want to be sure that they haven't browned or overcooked. And then when they're done, they're just like this, and they're soft and lovely. And then you're ready to make your garlic sauce. And so, I've got to get a plate out here to put some of these things on. And so we're going to have 2 tablespoons of flour. We're going to make a roux, the way you begin all sauces. One heaping tablespoon is the same as 2 level tablespoons. So we'll have 1 heaping tablespoon. Then I've got to have a wooden spoon, and that's supposed to cook for about 2 minutes, because as in all of these white sauces, you cook your butter and your flour together so that you don't have a pasty, floury taste. And then after that's cooked for 2 minutes, you then take it off heat, and you put in 1 cup of hot milk, and you just pour that all in, and then stir it up with a little wire whip, and then bring it to the boil. And while that's coming up to the boil, we can beat up our potatoes a little bit more. And I want to be sure that they have plenty of salt and pepper in them. And I'm going to put in about a good teaspoon of salt, because when these potatoes were steamed, so they weren't cooked in salted water, and then some good whaps of pepper, and then beat that all up. And then be sure and taste it to see if it's just exactly right. Very good. I'm going to put a little more salt in, I think. And then, after this has come to the boil, you put it through a sieve right into your potatoes. Now with this dish, you can make your potatoes a little bit ahead of time, and you can make your garlic sauce ahead of time, but be sure that you don't combine the two until the very last minute. If you do combine them ahead of time, you find that it loses something. I'm putting a little more salt in there, something of its sort of a lovely, fluffy, delicious quality. Now that's thickened up, you see. And so we're going to be ready to serve, so we sieve the garlic sauce into our mashed potatoes. You see, the garlic is so soft now that it goes right through the sieve, and you'll be amazed after it's been cooked that way. You see, first it was blanched, and then you had it cooked slowly in butter, and then it was cooked in its sauce. All that really heavy bite has gone out of it. And there remains sort of an absolutely delicious something that you don't know quite what it is, but it's lovely. And then you can put in a little bit of cream. This is the kind of a recipe like all the ones that we're going to do today, that you just sort of use your own judgment about how things should be. There. Then I'm going to put in a little bit of parsley. I'll put in about 3 tablespoons of parsley, which will be rather nice, and then we're ready to serve. So I'm going to go and get my warm dish, which is in the warming oven. And it's also a good idea to put a little bit of butter in the dish, because that means that the potatoes won't stick to it. It also gives a little more butter flavor, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then in go the potatoes. I think if I put them in with a rubber spatula, it would be a little easier. I think you'll find that this is such a good dish, you'd probably better make twice as much as you think you ought to have. And I think sort of a slightly rough assembly is the nicest way to do it, and then put on a little more parsley. If you want, you could put a little more butter on top. It just depends on how fat you want to get. But the more butter, the better, I always think. So those are ready to serve. And remember that these would be done only at the last moment. So I'll put them over here, and then we're ready. We're going to be ready after I've cleaned up a little bit for our next vegetable. And this is, I'm continuing to do the idea of the usual vegetables done in an unusual way. Now I've got to do some heating up here before I go on. Put that over there. Now I'll get rid of these. And then we have cucumbers, which of course most people think of cucumbers just as a salad vegetable, but they're absolutely delicious when they're cooked. And I think it's so nice to have a change and you'll find that they go extremely well with chicken and with all kinds of other things. So if you're going to cook cucumbers, you always want to peel them first, because if in cooking the peel gets dark, and also in many cucumbers now the peel has some kind of a wax on it, so you really can't eat it at all anyway. So just peel it with a vegetable peeler. In France, they have cucumbers that are about a foot long, and they're simply beautiful, but they have a rather bitter taste to them. I don't know why. Ours certainly, at least I've never tasted a bitter American cucumber. And then for this, you want to cut them in half lengthwise, and then you want to scoop out the seeds. The seeds and that this center portion has an awful lot of water in it. If you want to save the seeds, you can save them for something. I don't know what. Maybe you want to put them into your soup. But when the seeds cook up, they get to be a little tough also. So I'm scraping them just out with a teaspoon. And then we're going to cut them into strips. So cut it in half, and then cut that strip in half lengthwise again. And then cut it into 3, so they're about 2 inches long. There's your other one, cut in half. Cut the half in half, and then cut the half in half. In other words, that's 4 pieces for each half. And then again into thirds, and then into a bowl. And now you have the problem here of, if you're going to cook cucumbers, they've got so much water in them. I don't know, I suppose it's about 80% vegetable water. And you've got to get rid of that water somehow before you cook them. And an easy way is to drop them in boiling salted water, and then after you've drained them, the vegetable water has stopped. I mean, it doesn't exude anymore, but then you also lose most of your taste. And the best way, I think, is to take your raw cucumbers and sprinkle just a little pinch of sugar. And for 4 cups of cut cucumbers, you'd want about 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now, it's the salt that draws the water out, and the sugar, and about 1 tablespoon for 4 cups of red wine vinegar. The sugar and the vinegar sort of accentuate the cuky taste of the cucumbers. And then you've got your salt and your sugar and your vinegar in, and then toss them like this, and let them sit for at least half an hour. And then I want you just to see what happens, all this water that comes out. See, these have already been macerating or soaking in their salt. And look at all that water. That's just their plain, ordinary vegetable water that's draining out. You can imagine what a mess that would make if you tried to cook them that way, because then all the water would come out and it would take you a long time to reduce it. Now these are ready to cook, so you want to dry them. So take some paper towels and just dry them well on that. This is a very important thing if you're going to cook them. You want to just get them as dry as possible. Now those proportions for the salt maceration are, for every 4 cups of cut cucumbers, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and 1 tablespoon of red wine vinegar, and about 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar. And let them macerate for at least 20 minutes. And now these are ready to cook. And these are very, very easy to cook. You can do them in the oven, but I think it's very nice to do them, to just saute them very lightly. And they only take about 4 or 5 minutes to cook. Now I'm putting in a bit of butter in there. And then as soon as that's melted, the cucumbers go in. I haven't let it melt completely, I really should, but then you don't need any more salt into them because they are already salted, and that after 4 or 5 minutes, and you can do them ahead if you want. There they are nicely, hardly browned at all, and you can add, if you'd like, you can add a little bit of chopped shallots and finish them off that way, and then a little bit of fresh parsley, and use this tossing method like this, and then they're ready to go into their serving dish. And if you want to, you can boil down some heavy cream and pour that into them and let it boil down a little bit more, and it makes a simply lovely dish. So there are your cucumbers, and now we have another interesting dish which are going to be made from, of all things, the old yellow turnip. A lot of people sniff at turnips, but I think I love them myself, and I particularly like them cooked this way. This is a turnip casserole called navet à la champenoise. This is a big yellow turnip, which is called a navet in France, so easy peeling. Cut it in half, then cut it in half again, and then peel it. And you'll notice in the peeling that you have to cut down probably about 1/16 of an inch, because you have to get through sort of a skin and then a second layer until you get to the very nice, clear, yellow flesh of the turnip. You can use white turnips in this recipe too. I rather like the yellow turnip because it has more flavor. And then cut it into slices, and cut the slices into strips, and then cut the strips into about 1/2-inch dice. And then, because the turnip is rather strong, you want to blanch it. That means drop it into boiling salted water and let it boil for about a minute or two, about 4 or 5 minutes. And while that's boiling, you can go on to the rest of the recipe, which is we have onions, and the onions are cooked in fat of some type. And the traditional recipe, à la champenoise, means from the Champagne country, and they do a lot of cooking in pork. So I've got some fresh fat pork, and you want to try that out first. In other words, to let it saute a little bit until it has rendered its fat, and then that'll take 2 or 3 minutes, and then you're going to cook in that your diced onion. So here's a peeled onion, and cut it in half, and cut it in up and down strips, and then I have to move it back here, then in horizontal strips, and then when you cut down, it falls into dice. I would advise you to, just for fast cooking, learn how to do this kind of slicing. See, there's the flat side down, then make up and down cuts, not cutting all the way through to the other end, and then horizontal cuts. Be sure that you have a nice sharp knife, and then cut right down. And then when your when your fat pork has tried itself out, and I'm not cooking it as long as it should, because it would take 3 or 4 minutes. Then you would add your onions and let them cook very slowly for about 5 or 6 minutes until the onions are tender. And while those are cooking, we will drain our turnips, because they should be done now. I think sometimes people don't like the yellow turnip or rutabaga because it has a rather strong taste. But if you give them this little preliminary boiling first, that takes out the very strong taste. Then we're now ready to go back with our turnips. And those are done, and we're now ready to make the little sauce that the turnips are going to cook in. And you wait it until your onions have become tender. Mine aren't quite tender enough, so I'm going to have to add a little bit of butter in there. And then you want to have a tablespoon of flour. And they're making, again, another roux. And you want a little bit of sage as an herb flavoring. And you let the flour and the onions cook for about a minute, and then you put in some liquid. I'm putting in about 2/3 of a cup of canned beef bouillon. Or if you have any homemade bouillon, that's fine, and that acts as your thickening. And then your blanched turnips go in, and you turn them around into this sauce, and then you cover the dish and let them cook for about half an hour until the turnips are tender. And I have some here that have already been cooked. You see, they've cooked down quite a bit. And you can serve them either in the casserole like that, or you can serve them in a separate dish. Just turn them in. You see, you've cooked them about half an hour covered, and if you find that the liquid hasn't reduced enough, you then take the cover off and let it cook a little bit longer so that the liquid reduces, and then again you would put in a little bit of, cover it with a little bit of minced parsley. This is a delicious dish, and if you have people in your family that aren't crazy about turnips, I think you'll find they just love them this way. So we're now ready to serve them. And we have our birds who have been impatiently waiting all this time for their vegetables. We have our roast duck, and we have our navet à la champenoise, our turnip casserole, and this really is one of the classic and best combinations I know. And then we have our roast chicken, which is going to be served with our concombre, our cucumbers. And this chicken and cucumbers is an awfully nice combination. Also, it's more unusual than most. And there's our chicken and cucumbers, and then we have our great big Turk the work and a drumstick for some hungry person, and a great mass of pomme de terre à l'ail, or garlic mashed potatoes. And I think this is the best vegetable accompaniment a turkey could possibly have. And with either one of these birds, you would serve a red wine, and you'll love these vegetables, and these birds love these vegetables, so everybody is happy. That's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.